Hey, J.K. Rowling. Eat shit, TERF. I'm the face of a TERF. I salute you, J.K. Rowling. You are a true role model. J.K. Rowling can suck my genderqueer dick. Facts, penis news, don't want you to know. J.K. Rowling book sales up 10.9%. You are the bravest person on the press with J.K. Rowling, but they should be. J.K. Rowling has gone full Voldemort. Let's take a step back. After Rowling wrote an essay about her views on trans issues, plenty of people were quick to condemn or praise her. Some saw it as definitive proof that Rowling is a transphobe. Others saw it as the PC mob attacking someone for defending women. Plenty of people on both sides have made calm, reasonable arguments about this. Plenty of others haven't. But most of the responses to Rowling are missing out on one of the most important parts of this situation. Feelings. Welcome to Political Therapist, a channel about the role of human emotions in shaping our political views. Too often we overlook the importance of our feelings in political discussions, and when we do, we tend to view them as a sign of poor argumentation and weakness, not a natural part of being human. In Rowling's case, emotions are what caused her to write the essay, and are the primary reason for many of her concerns. She ends the essay with a call for empathy. And today, to celebrate J.K. Rowling and Harry Potter's birthday, I'd like to give her the empathy she asks for. This isn't about condoning her views. It's about understanding them. In her essay, Rowling is fairly explicit about how her emotions drive her. I'm going to go through that. As a teenager, she was insecure in her own femininity. She struggled with OCD and felt like an other, not what society expected a woman to be like. As she grew older, she found comfort in female writers and the ideas of feminism. However, misogyny still threatened her. Her first husband was physically abusive, and she still carries the scars of that marriage with her today. She's been insulted with misogynistic slurs her entire life, and this isn't in the essay, but I think I can safely infer it. As a famous person, even before this current wave of backlash, she's faced plenty of harassment. Rowling used some of her wealth to start a charitable trust called Volant to support women and children in Scotland. Since becoming famous, she's done her fair share of political activism. She's advocated for women and children, donated to the Labour Party, viewed herself as a feminist her whole life. And then, she started looking into trans issues. Partially, this was research for her Robert Galbraith novels. Mostly, it was personal. On one hand, she feels compassion for individual trans people. She writes, "If you could come inside my head and understand what I feel when I read about a trans woman dying at the hands of a violent man, you'd find solidarity and kinship." One of her friends is an older trans woman, and Rowling sees her as a woman. As she started to read more, trans activism felt like it was advocating against the idea of biological sex. Terms like menstruators felt sexist to her. It was reducing her womanhood to her period. Rowling wondered if she would have tried to transition as a girl. These days, huge numbers of young girls were going to gender clinics. As these pieces came together, she started to feel that trans activism was a threat to biological womanhood. And whenever she voiced these views, she was met with outrage. It started with accidentally liking a tweet that she meant to screenshot. She tweeted support for Maya Forstater, who she viewed as an outspoken feminist. And the outrage that followed was angry, abusive, and sexist. This made her double down on her beliefs. Of course trans activists were sexist. They were yelling sexist things at her on Twitter. And the stuff that these gender-critical feminists were saying made sense to her. Trans activism was scary, and these activists were saying things that didn't make any sense to her. Having been an outspoken feminist her entire life, the backlash against her just felt like a new wave of misogyny. And so, she wrote a blog post clarifying her views. Rowling's actual views here are sometimes misunderstood. I'm about 75% sure that Rowling believes that trans women, or at least some of them, are women. She says both that transition will be the solution for some, and that she knows a trans woman who she considers to be a woman. Again, not defending, just clarifying. Her views on what she calls trans activism are much less gentle. She believes that these activists are pushing to erode the legal definition of sex and replace it with gender. And throughout the essay, she responds to arguments that very few people, if anyone, are making. I should also mention that she's tweeted things that are a little inconsistent with the beliefs expressed in her essay. She tweeted a Medium post which says things like, "There's no real evidence for transition easing gender dysphoria over therapy," and doesn't make any caveats about transition being good for at least some trans people. And she deleted a tweet praising Stephen King after he replied to her saying, "Trans women are women." But that may have had more to do with the snarky tone than the content. Returning to her essay, Rowling's core belief on these issues comes from her emotions. J.K. Rowling believes that making it easier to be trans harms women. She writes, "When you throw open the doors of bathrooms and changing rooms to any man who believes or feels he's a woman, and, as I've said, gender confirmation certificates may now be granted without any need for surgery or hormones, then you open the door to any and all men who wish to come inside." That is the simple truth. And to plenty of people, nothing about that seemed simple or true. The people criticizing J.K. Rowling are by no means a monolith. Some of them are trans, most of them are probably cis, since most people are cis, and some of them just want to yell at her. Some of the people don't actually understand her perspective. But just because these people exist doesn't mean that the movement they're part of is in any way wrong. And Rowling's core belief here, that helping trans people hurts women, that's going to make trans people rightly angry. So, again, empathy. The trans community is an incredibly vulnerable and marginalized population. 40% of trans people report having attempted suicide. Research shows that trans people become much less likely to be depressed and anxious if they transition and are accepted by the people around them. But society is generally not accepting of trans people. For one, most cis people don't even understand what a trans person is. There are also people like this who argue about it for sport, seemingly just to crush the humanity of trans people. And they also have to deal with so-called gender-critical feminists, some of whom just find trans people disgusting, while others are voicing concerns. And plenty of trans people love Harry Potter. It's a story about love and friendship and accepting people who are different. And so, J.K. Rowling liking tweets like this feels like a slap in the face. And she doubled down on her beliefs by tweeting support for a transphobe, seemingly not listening to anyone. That made everything worse. And when she wrote a 4,000-word essay that strawman trans activists and made transphobes sound pleasant, that felt like a final attack on trans people. To many people, it didn't matter that she made a few statements of surface-level support for trans people, since the entire essay used misinformation to make the people who are trying to make life easier for trans people sound evil. After all, plenty of bigots make surface-level statements of support to disguise their bigotry. Because the essence of the essay is an argument that making life easier for trans people hurts women. For starters, the how of that doesn't make much sense. After all, the argument about bathrooms is logically nonsense. Nobody is checking gender recognition certificates at the bathroom door. And Rowling must know this. She wrote an entire book about boys going into a girl's bathroom. Going through the other parts of her essay, the facts are dubious. This may be a channel about emotions, but facts still matter. Here's a non-exhaustive list of things Rowling was wrong about. Desistance. Rowling writes that research has shown that between 60 to 90% of gender dysphoric teens will grow out of their dysphoria. For one, these studies are of prepubescent children and not teens. This phenomenon is known as desistance, when children diagnosed with gender dysphoria, who haven't taken any steps towards a medical transition, stop having gender dysphoria by their teenage years. The research on this subject does show that about 60 to 90% of gender dysphoric children aren't dysphoric as teenagers. But these studies are controversial for a number of reasons. I'll suffice it to say that these studies might say more about the definition of gender dysphoria and the social stigma around it than whether kids stay trans. Detransitioning. This is very different from desistance. Detransitioning is when someone who has taken medical steps to transition tries to undo them. Rowling argues that detransition rates are rising. For one, detransition rates are incredibly low. Estimates range from 0.5% to 4%. Also, there's no research showing that detransition rates are rising. Marcus Evans. She cites an article written by psychologist Marcus Evans as proof that teenagers won't kill themselves if not permitted to transition. Not only is this a ridiculous straw man, people argue that risk of suicide and depression decreases post-transition, but the piece she's referring to doesn't say what she thinks it says. Basically, Evans is weighing in on a debate about the effectiveness of different forms of therapy for dysphoric children. Again, children, not teenagers. Not saying anything about whether teenagers kill themselves if they don't transition. There's plenty of research to show that trans people are happier and have lower levels of anxiety and depression post-transition, including some research that's been done on socially transitioned children. Gender recognition certificates. Rowling says now gender recognition certificates, or GRCs, can be given to a man who intends to take no hormones and have no surgery. This isn't quite true, seeing as someone needs to provide 2 medical reports in order to acquire a GRC, and it would be hard to fulfill these requirements without taking any hormones or surgery. As for the plans proposed by the Scottish government, Rowling claims that all a man needs to become a woman is to say he's one, which is basically wrong, since a trans person needs to live as the opposite gender for 6 months in order to secure a GRC. Also, in terms of the practical realities of daily life, a gender recognition certificate doesn't really influence what gender someone lives as. This was by no means everything Rowling was factually wrong about, but I bring up these inaccuracies to show how frustrating this essay would be for a trans person. For people who've done any research on these debates, most of these claims are nothing new. They're just the same slightly misinterpreted statistics. Some of them involve a level of ambiguity that Rowling doesn't acknowledge, while others are just completely misinterpreted. To people fighting for trans rights, by making this argument, Rowling is doing tangible harm. The piece empowers bigots and makes trans people afraid. The trans community is already marginalized and feared. Rowling is stoking this volatile fire with misinformation and fear. And so, we arrive back where we started. Twitter. Before she wrote this essay, Rowling tweeted this thread about if sex isn't real. Here, none of the content of what she was saying is objectionable, but the implications feel a little transphobic. Nobody, or almost nobody, is saying that sex isn't real. A blue checkmark TV critic responds, "Please, talk to some queer people, please." He's saying, if you talk to trans people, you'll grow to understand the problems with this rhetoric. And so Rowling responds by saying, "I was just talking to a queer person, and she agrees with me." It's easy to mock Rowling here for using a worse version of the black friend argument. I can't be transphobic, I have a lesbian friend. But the deeper issue here is communication. The emotions and arguments behind their tweets aren't understood. One side says TERF, while the other side says that J.K. Rowling is a feminist hero. Throughout her essay and tweets, Rowling made a few points with a factual basis. There seems to be some evidence that unisex changing rooms increase sexual assault. And there's some credible reporting showing that a UK gender clinic called the Gender Identity Development Service has some management issues. Also, despite their small numbers, detransitioners probably should be more broadly accepted within the LGBT movement. But none of these issues contradict the trans rights movement. And none of them have to be put alongside Rowling's completely unfounded concerns about trans rights activists. I wish that we lived in a world where most people responded to Rowling with a calm fact-check that soothed her fears. To be fair, there is some of that. Scrolling through replies to her, the tone ranges vastly, sometimes adoring support, sometimes kind criticism, and sometimes outright vitriol. The UK trans charity Mermaids released an empathetic statement which noted her biases and fact-checked her errors. I'm guessing she didn't read it. Instead, she saw people calling her a TERF, or tweets that didn't even understand what she was saying. The opponents she saw felt like angry misogynists to her. And you know who was validating her? Who was listening to her and understanding her? The people who agreed with her. You can call them TERFs or gender-critical feminists, it doesn't really matter. She tweeted, "Since writing my essay, I've received over 3,000 emails thanking me for speaking up." And so, she became more secure in her fears. In response to her essay, The Sun published an interview with Rowling's ex-husband. "I slapped JK, and I'm not sorry." And trans activists denounced it. But at this point, I don't think any of that matters to Rowling. This is likely the final nail in her gender-critical coffin. The backlash against her gave her abuser a platform and allowed him to harass her once more. At this point, I don't think any amount of gentle correction can change that for her. And the people hurt most by this are trans people. The reasonable and empathetic tone of her essay can lead people to a true hatred of transgender people. Just Googling some of the phrases or research papers she mentioned can take anyone down an internet rabbit hole that starts with concerns and ends with outright bigotry. But if Rowling is harming trans people, so is the backlash against her. No one remembers the time that J.K. Rowling spoke out against Brexit because she didn't receive this level of backlash. Before hearing about this, I didn't even know J.K. Rowling had a blog. Why would I? Very few people read this essay because they read every blog post by J.K. Rowling. People read it because of the media coverage and outrage. In this case, so-called cancel culture didn't silence Rowling. It amplified her voice. I don't quite know what to make of this situation. There isn't a simple solution that ends with more empathy and less transphobia, but maybe we should try to view this case as a lesson. The next time a celebrity tweets something problematic or bigoted, try to understand what they're actually saying. Use empathy. Reply with a calm explanation, not outrage. Or maybe, and I think this is the best option of all of them, just ignore it.